This video is about production, including the different methods of production that businesses might use. It covers the difference between production and productivity and also looks at the importance of efficiency and how a business could improve their efficiency. So this is the first in our sequence of work on resource management. So looking at how a business takes resources and turns those into output that it can actually sell. So we're going to look first up here at the different methods of production, the different ways in which they could organise that process. So the first of those we're going to look at is going to be job production. And this is when a business makes tailor-made products to suit individual customer needs. So for examples of that, you might be thinking along the lines of creating a wedding cake or a tailor-made suit. So the good thing about that is it's highly flexible for the customers and you're going to be making a product that is very, very unique to customer needs. The downside to that is going to be that it's going to be very high cost in order to produce such an individualized product. So it's only really going to be appropriate when there is the demand for this level of individualized design. And so that's why actually those examples come from when people have a wedding, they want really individualized, unique products to be made for that wedding. If someone was buying a hammer to use for DIY, then they clearly wouldn't want something that's completely individualized. They just want something that was off the shelf. So you wouldn't use job production for something like that. They might also use flow production in order to produce their output, and that's kind of the other end of the spectrum in terms of how individualized the product is going to be. So with flow production, you're doing continuous production of pretty much a single standardized item. So maybe really simple supermarket ready meals, maybe very standard models of car manufacturing would use flow production. The good thing about this is it helps to save on costs. You can use a lot of machinery to replace labour. Efficiency is going to be high with high levels of output produced. Might be able to benefit more from economies of scale, and a really consistent product is going to be produced. The downside to that is going to be that you can't tailor those products at all to customer needs. So if there's any sort of demand for any kind of differentiated product, then flow production isn't going to be able to provide that. Business might also use batch production. So that's producing a set number of identical items. So in a way, it's kind of similar to flow production, but you're producing those items in slightly different batches. So you might be doing that maybe if you're producing pizzas and you're producing different types of toppings. So you produce a batch with your pepperoni, a batch with your ham and pineapple. So you've got that level of differentiation, but it's still quite high output kind of flow production. So you still get a lot of those benefits of flow production, but it gives a little bit more flexibility and ability to differentiate products to different customer tastes and requirements. And then finally, we've got cell production. And so that's using that kind of production line technology, but to produce quite a range of products quite flexibly. So you're producing those flexible and individual products, but on quite a large scale and on quite large production lines. So you can then combine some of those benefits of flow production. You get the large scales, you get the economies of scale, but you get a lot of the benefits of job production as well, that you're making quite a tailor-made and a relatively individualized products. So for that, think about maybe quite a high-end maybe car manufacturer who's responding to customer requirements. Maybe if the customer wants different specifications, different types of alloy wheels or different types of seats in the car, they can respond to that. They're still producing on a relatively large-scale production line, but kind of each product that they produce can be a little bit more individualized to customer requirements. Now, there's a really important distinction to be made in business between production and productivity. So production is quite simply the total output produced by a business in a given period of time. whereas productivity is a measure of the output per unit of input. So that would be calculated by the total output produced, the production, divided by the numbers of resources, the inputs being used in order to produce that output. And that's perhaps a bit more easily explained using an example. So imagine you've got a maker of cricket bats and they make 75 bats a week with 5 workers. And then they add an additional 3 workers, and between them they're able to make 275 bats. So what's the production before and after, and what's the productivity before and after? Well, the production is just the total output in that time. So the production before is 75 bats and after is 275 bats, but the productivity before the change is your 75 bats divided by your 5 workers, which is 15 bats per worker, whereas your productivity after the change is the 275 bats divided by the now 8 workers, which gives you almost 34.5 bats per worker. So whereas both production and productivity have increased in that example, you can see the productivity has increased by significantly more than the increase in production. Now, it's very, very common to do that productivity calculation and work out labour productivity, as we've done there, the productivity per worker. But you could also work out capital productivity, or the productivity of your machinery that you're using. So imagine you've got a firm that's using 5 3D printers and they're making guitars with those 3D printers, and so they can make 20 guitars in a day with those 5 3D printers. They then have to sell one to raise finance, and after this they can only make 18 guitars. So before and after then, you can see their production clearly has gone down. It's gone down from 20 guitars to 18 guitars. But before that change, we would work out the productivity as 20 guitars divided by the 5 3D printers, which is 4 guitars per printer. And then after the change, we've now got 1 fewer 3D printers, so we'll be doing the 18 guitars divided by 4 3D printers to give us 4.5 guitars per printer. So in that example, while production has gone down, productivity, the output per unit of input being used to produce that output, has actually increased. Now, if that's what productivity is and how we calculate it, the next question is, what is the significance of all this? Why is productivity so important? Because it is really, really important. And I would say it has been one of the most important things for the UK economy over the last sort of 10 to 20 years, has been trying, and for businesses to try to improve their levels of productivity. And so think about why this is. Well, I would say that improving productivity helps businesses to reduce their cost per unit, so their cost per unit of output produced. And that is because if you improve productivity, it means that you can produce more with less. And those resources that you're using to produce that output all have to be paid for. And so if you can produce more with the same amount of resources, or the same amount with fewer resources, then that means your productivity is going to be higher and it's going to reduce your cost per unit of output. And that means that it's going to improve your competitiveness. So that's your ability to compete and attract customers in relation to other businesses, and obviously in relation to your competitors. And the reason for that is because if your cost per unit is lower, you can really do one of two things. You can either reduce your price and keep your profit margin the same. So if you're producing more with less, the cost to produce each unit of output is lower, then that enables you to reduce your price relative to your competitors and attract more customers. Or you could go down a different route and you could keep your prices the same, but each unit of output that you sell is going to be generating an increased profit margin because the cost of producing that unit of output is going to be lower. Going now then from why productivity is important to how a business could achieve those increases or improvements in productivity. So what factors are going to affect a business's productivity that they can work on to achieve those increases? So you might look at investment in capital equipment and improving those production processes. So by capital equipment, we mean machinery, any man-made aids to the production process. And so if you can invest in improving the quality of and updating your capital, machinery and equipment, then that equipment is going to be able to produce more output using the same amount of that equipment, and that's going to increase productivity. Or the other way to approach that is think about it from the point of view of labour. And actually, overwhelmingly, the biggest cost for most businesses is going to be the cost of their labour. So if you can improve the productivity of labour, then that's going to go a significant way towards improving overall productivity. So you might look at training and education programs in order to improve the ability and the skills of the workforce. If you've got a higher skilled, more able workforce, they're going to be able to produce a higher amount of output. And then the other way of approaching that increasing labour productivity is to look at the motivation of workers. And motivation is a whole topic in itself, but one just small example of how you might achieve that might be through what we call job enrichment, which might involve making job roles more challenging, more interesting, which could then increase worker engagement and make them want to work harder, as well as being able and have the skills to work harder, but give them the motivation and make them want to work harder, which is then going to increase their output per worker, and that then helps to increase your productivity. Now, while there is some overlap between this idea of productivity and what we call efficiency, they're not exactly the same thing. So productivity is about increasing our output with the same amount of inputs, our output per unit of input, as we've just said. But efficiency is about making the best possible use of our scarce resources. And so one example of a way in which productivity might increase without necessarily efficiency increasing is if you're able to increase that output per unit of input, but you do that alongside increases to the amount of waste that you're making. And so that would be improving productivity, but you're not necessarily improving efficiency because you've got huge amounts of waste, which isn't therefore making the best possible use of your scarce resources. And so one way in which you could try and improve efficiency then would be by minimizing waste. And that's a really key thing to talk about when you're talking about efficiency. So a couple of other thoughts on efficiency and how it could be improved. We mentioned this with reference to productivity as well, but making the best and most effective use of the most up-to-date technology is going to help you with your efficiency as well. And we'll come back to this in a bit more detail just in a moment's time, but thinking about the balance between your different factors of production. So using either labour or capital intensive production and getting the right balance between those two could help you to improve your efficiency as well. Now, efficiency has an important link to average costs and your cost per unit of output. And that is because efficiency, the point for a business where efficiency is achieved, is going to be at the point where average costs are minimized. And for most businesses, if they were to graph their average cost curve, graphing costs against quantity of output here, then it's going to look a bit like a U-shaped here. And the reason for that is because at very, very low levels of output, their fixed cost for that business is going to be spread over very few units. And as we increase our output here, those fixed costs get spread over more and more and more units of output, and the cost per unit starts to come down. Think about how inefficient it would be for most businesses to produce only 1 or 2 units of output compared to increasing that output, and the average costs are going to come down. But at some point, for most businesses, cost inefficiencies are likely to kick in at very, very high units of output. So they're going to experience problems communicating, problems maybe coordinating their business, and they might find then that average cost starts to rise. So that's why we get that shape of the average cost curve, and the really key thing is the most efficient point for a business, the point where they'll experience efficiency, is going to be at this point here where average costs are minimized. So we said that one method of improving efficiency then was getting that balance right between the different factors of production. And what we mean by this is, as a business, should we use more labour relative to capital, and that would be called labour intensive production, or should we use more capital relative to labour, and that would be what we'd call capital intensive production. So why might a business look to err towards one of these different approaches? In terms of labour intensive production, that's going to allow you greater flexibility in response to customer requirements. So labour can more easily and more quickly respond to individualised and unique products. Think about the labour used to produce handmade and hand-designed products. Gives you that greater flexibility. And also, it's cheaper to start up. So if you're starting up as a business, employing 1, 2, 3, 4 workers is going to be cheaper initially than investing in huge amounts of capital equipment. Weighed against that, you might look at with the capital intensive processes, that's going to help to increase productivity because capital generally can produce more output in a shorter period of time. Just the speeds with which machines can work, the fact that they can work all hours of the day really without having the same breaks that labour would, means that you can produce more. You can therefore increase productivity, produce on a larger scale, and make the cost savings that come with producing in those higher volumes. I think going back to the idea of efficiency and getting that balance right, there's a few factors which a business's decision with respect to labour or capital intensive production is going to depend on. And I think the biggest one is going to be the relative cost of that labour compared to the capital. So if you look around most of the developed world where there's relatively high minimum wages and labour regulations, that means the cost of that labour is much higher, and so that's why you see things like self-service checkouts in supermarkets, and you see businesses trying to replace labour with capital because the cost of capital relative to labour is that bit cheaper. In comparison, in kind of emerging economies, you find the cost of labour a bit lower, and that's why you find more labour intensive production dominates in comparison. Another factor might be the size of the business. So capital intensive production is quite expensive in terms of that initial investment, but it can be cheaper over the long term as you don't have those consistent wages to pay every month. And so smaller businesses are likely to be more labour intensive as they start up because they can't afford that big investment in capital equipment. But then as they grow, they might start to replace some of that labour with capital because of the benefits they see from increasing that productivity.